The Hollow Room. Section 1. The Invitation. The old house stood at the edge of the forest, a sprawling, decaying structure surrounded by trees that seemed to lean toward it, their gnarled branches casting long, twisted shadows over the darkened ground. It had always been an object of curiosity in the small town of Everwood, a house that no one dared to approach, yet everyone whispered about. The windows, thick with layers of grime and dirt, gave it an eerie, abandoned look, but people who had lived near it swore they saw flickers of movement behind those glass panes, figures, perhaps, or just the trees playing tricks on the eye. It had been years since anyone had dared step inside the house. Many believed it to be haunted, others thought it was cursed. But that didn't stop the rumors from circulating. Tales of strange happenings, unexplained noises, and the whispers that carried on the wind filled the air like fog, lingering and never quite clearing. And then, one evening, the invitation came. It was late September when Julia Thompson received the letter. The envelope was old, the paper yellowed with age, the handwriting uneven, almost shaky. She had been sitting at her kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea, when the postman dropped it through the mail slot. She didn't think much of it at first. The house she lived in was far enough from the town center that she didn't expect any visitors or personal letters. But as she unfolded the paper, her fingers trembling, she couldn't shake the strange sense of foreboding that washed over her. The letter read, "Dear Julia Thompson, you are cordially invited to spend the night in the Hollow Room at the Manor of Everwood. The room awaits you, and we believe you will find its secrets most intriguing. Please arrive at sundown. Sincerely, the keeper of the Hollow Room." Julia stared at the letter for a long time, her mind racing. She had heard stories of the Hollow Room, stories of a room that existed outside of time and space, a room that could only be entered by those who had been chosen. The more she thought about it, the more the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. But curiosity outweighed the unease that had begun to creep up on her. Julia had always been drawn to the unknown, to the mysteries that others avoided. She had grown up hearing the town's stories about the manor, and though she hadn't believed most of them, there was something about this letter, something about the invitation itself, that stirred something deep within her. She had to go. She had to see it for herself. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Julia found herself standing in front of the manor, the massive structure looming over her. The air had grown colder, and a strange wind swept through the trees, sending a shiver down her spine. The door to the house creaked open as if it had been waiting for her. No one was in sight, but she could sense that she was now alone. The interior was as dusty and dilapidated as she had imagined, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The walls were lined with faded portraits of people whose faces were half obscured by the grime, and the floorboards creaked under her feet as she stepped carefully inside. As she made her way deeper into the house, she found the stairs that led to the second floor. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from a single, flickering candle that stood on a pedestal at the far end. There was a sense of movement in the shadows, something intangible that seemed to watch her every step. She reached the end of the hall, where a door stood slightly ajar. The room behind it was shrouded in complete darkness, a darkness so thick that it seemed to pulse with life. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, and she was plunged into an oppressive, suffocating blackness. For a moment, Julia stood frozen in place, unable to move or speak. The air felt heavy, thick with something she couldn't quite place. Then, she heard it, the faintest of whispers, just beyond the reach of her hearing. It sounded like a voice, but it was distant, muffled, as if it came from another world. The darkness seemed to close in on her, and Julia reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing against something cold and smooth. It felt like stone, but it was warm to the touch. She pulled her hand back quickly, but the sensation lingered, like something was pressing in on her from all sides. Suddenly, the room seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, shifting and reshaping themselves. The floor beneath her feet seemed to bend, as though it were no longer solid. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows around her began to take form. Shapes emerged from the darkness, tall, thin figures with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. They moved toward her, their limbs jerky and unnatural, like puppets controlled by invisible strings. One of them reached out to her, its fingers long and twisted, like claws. Julia tried to back away, but her legs refused to move. The figure's hand closed around her wrist, its grip cold and unyielding. "Welcome," it whispered, its voice a low, hollow sound that seemed to echo in her very bones. "Welcome to the Hollow Room." Section 2. The Unseen Force. Julia struggled to free herself from the creature's grip, her heart hammering against her chest. Its fingers were like ice, sending a wave of numbness up her arm. She tried to pull away, but the figure's hold was unyielding, as though it had no intention of letting her escape. "You cannot leave," the figure whispered again, its voice scraping across Julia's nerves like nails on a chalkboard. The shadows in the room swirled around them, their movement hypnotic and dizzying. Every time Julia tried to focus on the figure in front of her, her vision blurred, the darkness closing in. The air was suffocating, too thick, too heavy, and Julia felt herself growing weaker, as though the very spa. Her panic rose as the figure's grip tightened, pulling her closer. She tried to scream, but her voice was trapped inside her throat, as if the room itself had swallowed it whole. The walls around her groaned, bending inward with a menacing creak, as if they too were alive, complicit in the growing nightmare. "Let me go!" Julia managed to croak, her voice barely audible in the suffocating silence that had overtaken the room. The figure's face contorted into a twisted, unnatural smile, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. "You cannot escape, Julia. You were chosen." The words echoed in her mind, resonating with an eerie certainty. She could feel the presence of something ancient, something dark, lingering in the very fabric of the room. It was watching her, feeding off her fear. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though the room itself were alive. Julia stumbled, trying to steady herself, but her legs felt like jelly. She could feel her strength fading, slipping away like sand through her fingers. "You belong here now." The figure's grip was unrelenting, and as it spoke, the shadows in the room began to take shape. They became more defined, their forms shifting and twitching, like creatures made from the very darkness itself. They moved closer to Julia, their cold, empty eyes staring at her with unblinking intensity. She could hear their whispers now, soft, like a distant wind, but somehow more sinister. The air was thick with the hum of their voices, each one blending into the next until they were a single, overwhelming sound. "You're not real," Julia gasped, her voice shaky as she tried to pull free. "This is just a dream. A nightmare. You can't be real." The figure in front of her laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that seemed to reverberate in every corner of the room. "You're not dreaming, Julia. You're here. This place is real. And it is yours now." The shadows stretched toward her, their forms becoming more defined, more solid. They crawled up her legs, winding around her like serpents, their cold touch sending shivers of dread down her spine. She could feel their presence pressing in from all sides, their eyes watching her every movement. "No one leaves the hollow room," the figure whispered again, its voice impossibly close now. Julia could feel its breath on her skin, cold and foul, as though it had been waiting for her to arrive. She tried to break free, but her body refused to obey. Her limbs were heavy, sluggish, as though they no longer belonged to her. The shadows twisted and writhed around her, and Julia felt herself being pulled deeper into their embrace. She struggled, her heart pounding in her chest, but it was no use. The darkness was consuming her, pulling her down into a place she couldn't escape. "This isn't real. This can't be happening," she thought desperately, her mind racing to make sense of the impossible situation. She had to find a way out, to break free from whatever force was controlling her. But as she tried to focus, her thoughts began to scatter, her mind becoming clouded by the relentless pull of the shadows. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they drowned out everything else. "You are ours now." The words echoed in her ears, and Julia felt herself begin to fade, her body growing cold, her strength draining away. Suddenly, there was a sharp sound like a door opening, and the darkness around her faltered. A sliver of light pierced through the shadows, cutting through the oppressive blackness. Julia blinked, her vision returning in a burst of clarity. For the first time since entering the room, she could see something beyond the swirling mass of darkness. The figure in front of her recoiled, its form shifting as if it were being pulled back into the shadows. The grip on her wrist loosened, and for the briefest of moments, Julia was free. She stumbled backward, gasping for breath, her heart racing. But the light, distant, faint as it was a beacon, drawing her toward it. The figure in the shadows retreated, their presence lessening, though not completely gone. It was as though they were waiting, watching her every move. Julia didn't hesitate. She turned toward the light, moving quickly, her legs shaking with fear and exhaustion. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing for certain. She had to get out of that room, away from the suffocating darkness, away from the things that watched her from the shadows. With each step she took toward the light, the room seemed to shift again. The walls seemed to bend and twist, and the floor groaned under her weight. But the light was closer now, a steady, unwavering glow in the distance. "You cannot leave," the figure called after her, its voice more distant now, almost a whisper. "You belong to us." But Julia didn't look back. She didn't stop. She kept moving toward the light, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she pushed herself forward. The darkness pressed against her, but she could feel the pull of the light growing stronger, guiding her, urging her to continue. And then, as she reached the edge of the room, the last of the darkness fell away. Section 3. The Whispering Walls. Julia stumbled into the hallway, her legs weak, trembling under the strain. Her lungs burned with the effort of each breath, and her heart raced erratically. She had never been so frightened in her life, not even as a child when she'd spent countless nights staring out her window at the house, wondering about the mysteries inside. Now, standing in the dimly lit hallway, she could hear the faint hum of the whispers growing louder again, reverberating from the walls themselves. The shadows were gone, but their presence lingered like a stain in the back of her mind. The light that had once seemed so distant now filled the corridor, casting long, warped shadows on the cracked plaster walls. She pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to steady herself, but the dizziness wouldn't subside. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched. Taking a deep breath, Julia forced herself to move, one slow step after another. The house felt different now, as though it had become aware of her, attuned to her every move. The air was thick, and the sound of her footsteps echoed, far louder than they should have been. She felt like the walls themselves were leaning in toward her, closing in, as if the house was trying to contain her, trap her once again. At the far end of the hallway, she noticed something strange, a door that hadn't been there before. She was certain she hadn't seen it when she entered. The door stood alone, its wooden frame dark and worn, the surface marred with scratches and deep grooves. It looked ancient, like something that belonged in another time, another place. Something tugged at her, some unknown force pulling her toward it. She knew she shouldn't go through that door. She knew it could lead to more horrors, more madness than she could bear. But she couldn't stop herself. The pull was irresistible, stronger than her fear, stronger than her rational mind that screamed at her to turn back. With a trembling hand, Julia reached out and touched the door handle. It was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt. The moment her fingers brushed against it, the whispering grew louder, sharper, more urgent. It was as though the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting. She turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in an eerie, pale light. The air inside was thick with dust, the stale scent of neglect overwhelming. But what caught her attention the most was the walls. They weren't solid. Instead, they appeared to be moving, shifting, pulsating as though they had a life of their own. They seemed to breathe with her, expanding and contracting with each inhale and exhale. The whispers came from them, not from a voice or a figure. They were in the very walls, in the very fabric of the room itself. The sound was maddening, a low, guttural hum that reverberated through Julia's bones. She could almost feel the words that had no form, no structure, slip into her mind like a poison. You are here with us, forever. Julia recoiled, stumbling back toward the door, but it slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash. The room's walls pressed in on her, narrowing, closing, and for the first time since entering this place, Julia felt the suffocating weight of true terror. She was trapped. The walls, they were moving closer. You will never leave. The voice wasn't just in her mind anymore. It was in the room with her, echoing off the walls, swirling around her. The walls pulsed and throbbed, their movement unnatural and disturbing. The whispers grew louder, now almost overwhelming, drowning out everything else, until they were all she could hear. She tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed up by the room, consumed by the dark, thundering noise. Her heart pounded in her chest, the world around her spinning. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The walls, once pressing in, suddenly fell still. Silence blanketed the room, but it wasn't comforting. The silence was thick, oppressive, as though it had weight. And then, she saw them. Figures stood along the walls, emerging from the shifting shadows. Their bodies were thin and elongated, their features indistinct, blurred by the ever-moving surface of the walls. They stared at her with hollow eyes, their expressions unreadable. They were watching her, waiting. Julia's pulse quickened again, her legs shaking as she backed away, her eyes darting around for an escape. The door. She had to get out. She had to. But as she turned, the door was gone. The space she had just entered had been sealed off, the walls now solid, blocking her path. "No one leaves," one of the figures whispered, its voice barely audible but unmistakable in the deafening silence. "You will never leave the hollow room." Julia collapsed to her knees, her hands trembling as she fought to maintain her grip on reality. She was trapped, but somewhere deep in her mind, she felt the urge to push forward, to find the answers hidden in this room. What was it? What had been waiting for her? And why had she been chosen? The walls began to pulse again, the figures around her shifting, moving closer. The whispers grew louder, but now they were different. They no longer spoke to her, they spoke of her. The hollow room remembers you. Section 4. The truth behind the room. The figures in the room closed in around Julia, their features still obscured by the shifting walls. Their hollow eyes fixed on her, unblinking, as though they had all the time in the world to watch her. The whispers had stopped for a moment, but the oppressive silence that followed was almost worse. Julia could feel her breath catch in her throat as she tried to steady herself. "The hollow room remembers you," the whisper repeated, but now it seemed to come from everywhere. It was no longer one voice, it was a chorus, 1,000 voices all blending into one, each carrying the same chilling words. Her pulse raced as the shadows around her seemed to stretch and grow, their forms becoming more tangible. They were not just in the walls anymore, they were moving, reaching out toward her, their limbs jerking unnaturally, like marionettes controlled by unseen hands. The air felt thick, charged with some invisible energy that crackled in her ears. Julia didn't know what to do. The figures weren't human, they couldn't be. Their eyes were empty, dark, but there was something unnervingly familiar about them. It was as if she had seen them before, or at least something like them. Something deep in her memory stirred, but she couldn't place it. It was buried too far, hidden behind a fog of confusion and fear. "You've been here before," one of the figures finally spoke, its voice low and slow, each word dragging on like it had to be pulled from somewhere deep within. Julia couldn't tell where the voice had come from, but it resonated in her chest, vibrating her very bones. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was struggling to exist within the room itself. Julia felt a strange pull toward it, an inexplicable connection that made her blood run cold. "You've always been here," the figure continued, its eyes fixed on hers. "You belong here, just as we do. You've always been one of us." Julia recoiled, her legs giving out beneath her as she fell to the ground. She tried to crawl backward, but the room seemed to tilt, the floor beneath her warping and shifting like the walls. She could feel the edges of her mind fraying as her thoughts began to scatter. Fragments of memories, disjointed, broken, flashed before her eyes. Suddenly, she remembered something. It was a brief, fleeting moment, a time from her childhood. She had been here before, but it wasn't just a memory. It was real. She had been in this room. She had stood in this place, gazing at these same figures, hearing these same whispers. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been here before. Julia gasped, her mind spinning as fragments of the past returned to her. She had been part of this place, a part of these figures, in a way she couldn't understand. But she had left, hadn't she? She had escaped, long ago. Or at least, that's what she had thought. The room, this place, wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just a random nightmare. It was a prison. A prison for her, for anyone who had ever stepped into it. And she had been its prisoner before. "We told you, you cannot leave," another figure intoned, its voice dripping with a strange kind of satisfaction. The walls pulsated again, their movement erratic, as though they were alive, feeding off the fear that flooded the room. The air was suffocating, heavy with the sense that the room itself was waiting for something. The whispers grew louder again, their words now more distinct, more personal. "You have always been ours. You cannot escape what you are." The words slammed into Julia's mind like a wave, drowning her in confusion and terror. She tried to fight back, but her body felt weak, as though it no longer belonged to her. The darkness that surrounded her seemed to swallow her whole, pulling her deeper into its grasp. But she couldn't give up. She couldn't let this place claim her again. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Julia pushed herself to her feet, stumbling backward as the figures continued to circle her. They were growing closer, their movements jerking and twitching as they closed in. She needed to remember. She had to understand what this place wanted from her, what it was trying to do. "You're not alone," the voice whispered again, this time softer, almost comforting, as though it were offering her something. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the air heavier, but Julia could feel something deep inside her, something that had been buried, something powerful. It was like a spark, a flicker of hope in the overwhelming darkness. She couldn't remember everything, but she remembered one thing she had left before. She had escaped. And she could do it again. The figures began to move faster, their forms becoming blurred, their faces twisted in mockery. They reached out for her, their fingers long and skeletal, but she didn't flinch. She focused on that flicker of light inside her, the tiny piece of hope that refused to die. She would not be consumed by this place. She would not become one of them. With a scream, she lunged forward, her hands outstretched toward the pulsating walls. As she made contact, a wave of energy surged through her, and the room shuddered violently. The figures screamed, their bodies contorting, twisting in agony as the walls began to crack and break apart. But as the room started to unravel, Julia felt a strange calm settle over her. The power within her grew stronger, the connection to the room fading. She was free. She had broken the cycle. And then, with one final push, the world around her shattered, and everything went dark. Section 5. The Return to Everwood. The darkness was suffocating. For a moment, Julia felt as if she were floating in an endless void, a place between existence and non-existence. Her body felt weightless, suspended in an emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. She couldn't tell where she ended and the darkness began. It was as though she was lost in the fabric of space itself, disconnected from everything she had ever known. But then, as if some unseen hand were pulling her, she began to feel the weight of her own body again. The pull of gravity returned, grounding her to the earth. Her limbs tingled as sensation flooded back into them, and with it, a sharp, sudden pain. She gasped, her lungs taking in a deep breath, filling with air that was real, solid, and cold. Slowly, her vision started to return, the darkness giving way to shapes, to light. The void was gone, and in its place was something else, something familiar, yet not. She blinked, trying to focus on what was before her, but her mind was sluggish, like a fog had descended over it, clouding her thoughts. It took a few moments before she realized where she was. She was standing in the middle of Everwood. The town was eerily still, its streets empty, the homes dark and silent. The air was heavy with an unnatural quiet, as if the town had been abandoned for years. Julia felt a shiver crawl up her spine, and instinctively, she wrapped her arms around herself, her eyes scanning the desolate landscape. But this wasn't the Everwood she remembered. The houses were dilapidated, their windows shattered, the paint peeling from their walls. The trees that lined the streets were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. Something was wrong. Julia took a hesitant step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't understand what was happening. She had escaped the hollow room. She had broken free. But now, she was back in Everwood, in a version of the town that felt wrong, unnatural. She took another step, and the sound of her footfall echoed too loudly in the silence. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as though the town itself was crumbling, decaying from the inside out. "It's not real," Julia whispered to herself, the words barely audible. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog in her mind. None of this is real. This can't be happening. But as she spoke, a chilling realization settled over her. This wasn't just some twisted dream or hallucination. This was real. Somehow, she had returned to Everwood, but not as it had been. She had returned to the version of Everwood that existed in the hollow room, a distorted reflection of the town she had once known. Her thoughts raced. Was she still trapped? Was this another part of the room? Was it all part of the same nightmare? She turned, looking down the street toward the town's old church, its tall steeple rising like a monument to something long forgotten. The doors were ajar, a faint light glowing from within. Something, or someone, was waiting for her there. With a sense of dread settling over her, Julia began to walk toward the church. Her steps were slow, measured, as if she were walking in a dream. The town seemed to stretch out before her, its empty streets and abandoned buildings making her feel even more isolated. She could hear the faintest rustling of wind through the branches above, but that was the only sound. The silence was oppressive. As she approached the church, the light inside grew brighter, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. She could feel her pulse quicken, the air around her thick with anticipation. What was waiting for her inside? Was it an illusion? Was it a trap? Julia reached the church doors, her hand trembling as she pushed them open. The hinges creaked in protest, and she stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The interior of the church was just as desolate as the town outside. The pews were overturned, the altar shrouded in shadows. But at the far end of the church, there was a figure. The figure was tall and indistinct, its features hidden in shadow. It stood perfectly still, as if it were waiting for her to approach. Julia's heart skipped a beat. The air in the church felt colder now, and she could almost hear the faintest whisper of voice, perhaps, but not one that she could make out. "Who are you?" Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to the figure or to herself. She didn't know if it was real. The figure did not respond. Instead, it began to move, its form shifting in the dim light. It didn't walk, it glided, its movements smooth, almost fluid. The closer it came, the more it seemed to blur, its shape becoming less defined, as though it were made from the very darkness itself. "You should have never come back," The voice finally spoke, a cold, hollow tone that made Julia's skin crawl. The voice was familiar, but distorted, like a memory that had been twisted and warped. Julia stepped back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure stopped in front of her, its presence overwhelming. It was towering now, looming over her, its form still indistinct, as if it were a part of the shadows that filled the room. "You don't belong here," the voice continued, its words like a blade scraping against Julia's mind. "You belong to the hollow room, Julia. You cannot escape." Julia's heart raced, and for a moment, she was paralyzed with fear. This was no ordinary figure. It wasn't just some ghost or apparition. This was something far more powerful, something tied to the hollow room, something that had been waiting for her. She tried to step away, but her legs felt like lead. The figure's gaze, if it could be called that, seemed to pierce through her, seeing into the deepest corners of her soul. Julia felt the weight of its presence, felt the power of the hollow room pressing in on her once again. But then, something inside her shifted. The flicker of hope from before, the strength she had found in the hollow room, rose up within her. She wasn't going to give in. Not this time. She had fought too hard to break free, to let this figure drag her back into the darkness. With a fierce cry, Julia reached deep within herself, summoning every ounce of strength and willpower she had left. She pushed against the figure, her mind focused on one thing, escaping this place once and for all. The figure recoiled, its form flickering, unstable. It was weakening. Julia could feel it. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't trapped. With one final push, the figure shattered, its form dissolving into nothingness. The church fell silent once again, the oppressive air lifting as the figure vanished completely. Julia stood in the center of the church, her breath ragged, her body trembling. But she was free. For now. Section 6, The Choice. The church was silent once again, its cold, empty interior now seeming almost peaceful. The tension in the air had lifted, but Julia knew it was only temporary. The figure, whatever it had been, was gone, but she wasn't naive enough to think it was over. The hollow room had a way of making promises it could never keep, and this place, this twisted version of Everwood, had no intention of letting her go so easily. Her heart was still racing in her chest, the echoes of the voice of the figure lingering in her mind. "You belong to the hollow room." The words twisted in her thoughts, but Julia refused to let them take root. She had broken free once. She could do it again. She had to. But how? Her legs were shaky as she walked toward the shattered altar, the remnants of the once pristine church now lying in ruins. The floor creaked beneath her feet, and the air still felt charged, like static before a storm. There was something in the air, something heavy, waiting. Julia's instinct screamed at her to leave, to run, but she knew there was no running from this place, not until she understood why she was here and what it wanted from her. As she stepped closer to the altar, she noticed something strange. The walls, though cracked and damaged, seemed to hum with energy. At the base of the altar, hidden beneath the rubble, was a small, faintly glowing object. It pulsed with a soft, almost imperceptible light, beckoning her closer. The glow was faint, but it called to her urgently, insistently, as though it knew she would come. Julia hesitated, but curiosity and fear drove her forward. She knelt down, reaching her hand toward the object, her fingers trembling. The moment her skin made contact with it, a shock ran through her body, like an electric current surging through her veins. She gasped, but the sensation wasn't painful. It was familiar. A deep, bone-deep familiarity, like a memory that she couldn't quite place. As her fingers closed around the object, the room around her began to shift again. The walls rippled like water, distorting and twisting in ways that were both unsettling and hypnotic. The air became dense, almost oppressive, as though the very room itself were alive. Suddenly, the figure, the shadowy entity that had confronted her earlier, reappeared before her, though this time it was different. It no longer towered over her. It was smaller, more human, but its form was still undefined, like it was made from the darkness itself, shifting and flickering in and out of existence. "You shouldn't have done that," the figure intoned, its voice a low, guttural whisper that reverberated in the chamber. Julia stood her ground, clutching the object tightly in her hand. She could feel its power, its energy, pulsing through her. The figure's words didn't frighten her anymore. If anything, they only made her more determined. "What is this?" Julia demanded, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "What do you want from me?" The figure's shape flickered again, its face briefly taking on the semblance of someone she had once known. A flash of recognition hit her, a fleeting memory, just beyond her grasp. She felt her stomach twist. The face was almost familiar, but it was too distorted to be sure. "You were always meant to return," the figure said. "This is where you belong, Julia. The hollow room is your home, just as it is ours. You cannot escape what you are." Julia's grip on the object tightened. "No," she shouted. "I'm not like you. I'm not one of you. I won't stay here. I won't be trapped." For the first time, the figure paused, its flickering form seeming to hesitate. The air around them grew still, the tension thick enough to cut. Julia's heart was hammering in her chest as she stood face to face with the entity. She could feel the power of the object in her hand intensifying, surging through her with every heartbeat. It was like the energy of the room was trying to pull her in, to draw her back into the hollow room's grasp, but she fought against it with everything she had. "You don't have a choice," the figure replied, its voice colder now, filled with something almost sadistic. "The hollow room has already claimed you. And it always will." Julia's mind raced. "The hollow room has already claimed you." The words echoed in her head, and for a moment, she felt the room press in around her, its walls closing in, suffocating her. It was as if the entire space was alive, the darkness twisting and reshaping itself, trying to engulf her. But she couldn't let it. She wouldn't. In the distance, she heard a faint sound, like the rumble of thunder, growing louder by the second. It wasn't just thunder, though. It was something else, a presence. Something powerful. Something dark. And then, before she could react, the object in her hand flared to life. A brilliant, blinding light erupted from it, filling the room with an intense glow. Julia shielded her eyes as the light swirled around her, warping the very fabric of reality itself. The figure recoiled, its form shifting violently, flickering in and out of existence. The light grew brighter, pulsing with an energy that seemed to push against the figure, forcing it back. "No!" the figure cried, its voice warping, distorting, as if it were being pulled apart. "You cannot escape. But Julia was not listening. She couldn't stop now. With a final, desperate cry, she pushed the object forward, sending a shockwave of energy rippling through the room. The wall shook violently, and for a moment, the entire church seemed to collapse in on itself, folding inward like a dying star. The figure's form dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only the faintest echo of its voice. Julia felt herself being pulled into the light, the force of it wrapping around her, carrying her away from the church, from Everwood, from the hollow room. Her body was weightless, as though she were floating, untethered from reality. And then, with one final surge of power, everything went dark. Section 7, The New Beginning. The darkness was profound. Julia's mind raced, but it felt as though she were suspended in time itself, unable to grasp anything solid, her body weightless, her thoughts muddled. There was no sound. No light. Only the emptiness stretching out in all directions. For what seemed like an eternity, Julia could only drift, unable to tell if she was alive or not. Was she still in the hollow room? Had she escaped? Or had the room claimed her once again? She didn't know. The void around her offered no answers. But then, slowly, something began to shift. A faint pulse of light broke through the darkness, soft at first, but growing stronger. The pulse was rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, and with each beat, the world around her began to take shape once more. The light expanded, and with it came the faintest sounds, a distant rustling, the soft hum of energy, and the unmistakable sound of rain. Julia's mind grasped onto the sound, grounding her, and slowly, she became aware of her surroundings. Her vision blurred, but it cleared quickly, revealing something that shocked her to the core. She was lying on the ground, her hands pressed against cold, damp earth. The air was thick with the smell of wet leaves and soil, and the sound of rain falling softly around her was a stark contrast to the oppressive silence she had just experienced. She could feel the cool droplets hitting her skin, soaking into her clothes, but for some reason, it was comforting. Julia pushed herself up, her body sore, her limbs stiff from the disorienting experience she had just endured. She blinked rapidly, trying to orient herself, but as her eyes adjusted, she realized she was no longer in Everwood, and she wasn't in the hollow room either. She was outside, in a forest. Tall, dense trees surrounded her, their leaves rustling in the wind, and the ground beneath her feet was soft with moss. The rain fell steadily, creating a calming, almost hypnotic rhythm. It felt real. It felt peaceful. She stood up, brushing the wet earth off her clothes, her breath steadying as she took in her surroundings. There was no sign of the hollow room's influence here. No distortion. No oppressive energy. It was just a forest, and it felt strangely familiar. Julia's heart began to slow, but there was still a nagging doubt in the back of her mind. Had she really escaped? Was this place truly safe? She had to know. She had to find out where she was and what had happened. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes scanning the landscape. There were no signs of life, no other creatures or people, but the trees stretched on in every direction, as far as the eye could see. A part of her wanted to feel relief. She had fought so hard to escape, to break free from the hollow room's grasp. But now, standing in the midst of this quiet, rain-soaked forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off, something was lurking just beyond her reach. As she walked deeper into the forest, the silence enveloped her. There was no sound except the rain, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the soft thud of her footsteps on the forest floor. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their trunks twisting into the sky, their branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the light. The air was thick with moisture, and the mist from the rain hung in the air, adding to the surreal atmosphere. Julia's thoughts drifted as she walked. She thought about everything she had experienced, the hollow room, the figure that had confronted her, the object she had found, the light that had torn through the room's darkness. What did it all mean? What was the purpose of this place? Had she really broken free, or was she simply in another layer of the nightmare? She wasn't sure anymore. The forest felt endless, its path winding and twisting, almost as though it had no beginning or end. She didn't know how long she had been walking, but she couldn't stop. She had to keep moving. She had to keep searching for answers. After what felt like hours, she came upon a clearing. The rain had slowed, and the air felt slightly fresher. In the center of the clearing stood a large stone structure, an old, crumbling temple. It was ancient, its stone walls weathered by time and covered in thick vines and moss. The entrance was dark, shrouded in shadow, but there was something about it that called to her. Without thinking, Julia moved toward the temple. There was no fear in her steps, only a strange sense of inevitability, as if this was where she was meant to be. She reached the entrance and stood before the large, arching doorway. The darkness within seemed to beckon her, as though something waited for her inside. Julia didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her heart pounding, her senses alert. As she crossed the threshold, she was enveloped in complete darkness. The air was thick with the scent of age and decay, and the sound of her footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness. The temple's interior was vast, the high ceilings lost in shadow, the walls lined with ancient carvings. Julia's eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light, and she could just make out the faintest traces of symbols etched into the stone. They were old, ancient runes that she didn't recognize, their meanings lost to time. Her pulse quickened. This place was old. Older than anything she had ever encountered. And yet, there was something familiar about it. A part of her felt like she had been here before, like this temple, this place, had always been a part of her journey. But how? She moved deeper into the temple, her footsteps cautious, her senses alert. The air grew colder as she ventured further, and the silence deepened. There was no sound here, not even the rain. It was as if time had stopped entirely within these walls. As she continued, she came to a large chamber. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, upon which rested a small, glowing object. The object was familiar, the same kind of energy that she had felt when she first touched the mysterious object in Everwood. It was the same pulse of light. Julia's heart skipped a beat. She knew what she had to do. Section 8, The Final Choice. Julia stood before the stone pedestal, her fingers trembling as they hovered just above the glowing object. It pulsed softly, like a heartbeat, each flicker of light drawing her closer, filling her with a sense of inevitability. Her heart was racing, and though fear tugged at her, she couldn't deny the compulsion to reach out and touch it. It was as if the object itself was calling to her, urging her to make this final choice. The hollow room had been a mystery, an enigma, a place of torment and discovery. Every step she had taken through it had been a battle against her own fears, her own doubts. But now, standing at the threshold of this moment, Julia knew she had come too far to turn back. There was no escaping the consequences of what she had endured. This was it, the final decision. Her mind swirled with the echoes of the figure's voice, the warnings it had given her, and the haunting reality that had loomed over her since her arrival. But now, as she faced the glowing object, she no longer felt like a prisoner. She had endured the worst the hollow room could throw at her, and she had fought back. She had learned from it. The fear was still there, yes, but it was no longer the all-consuming force it once was. She was no longer just a victim of her circumstances. Julia closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady herself. The world around her seemed to vanish as she centered herself, shutting out the overwhelming pulse of energy emanating from the object. She had learned to silence the chaos within her, to control the overwhelming sensations that had once ruled her thoughts. When she opened her eyes again, the room seemed different. The shadows no longer pressed in on her, and the oppressive weight of the space had lifted. For the first time, the hollow room seemed almost empty. Empty, but in a way that was calming, a way that hinted at possibility. The fear was still there, of course, but now it felt like a choice, a challenge she could face rather than an unchangeable fate. Her fingers brushed the surface of the object. The moment her skin made contact with it, a surge of energy rocketed through her body. The world spun around her, the walls of the hollow room distorting in a dizzying whirl. The air seemed to pulse with an unearthly hum, the very fabric of reality bending under the force. Julia gasped, her breath stolen by the sheer power coursing through her veins. Her entire body trembled, her senses overwhelmed as the energy filled her, flooding her mind with visions. She saw herself again, her younger self, standing at the edge of a cliff, gazing out at the vast, endless horizon. She felt the same fear she had felt back then, that feeling of being on the brink of something terrifying. But now, she could see it for what it was, a challenge. Not an insurmountable wall, but a moment she could overcome. The vision shifted, showing the path she had taken from that moment to now. Every step, every hardship, every moment of self-doubt had led her here. "This is your choice," the figure's voice echoed in her mind. "You have already made it. The hollow room will never release you unless you embrace the truth. The choice is yours to make. Always was." The words reverberated in her thoughts, and Julia closed her eyes once more, focusing on the center of herself. She had spent so long running from this place, from the darkness inside her, but now she realized the truth. There was no escaping it, not completely. But she didn't need to. She didn't need to run anymore. Opening her eyes, Julia felt the energy around her settle, the overwhelming pulse of the object growing steady, calm. It was as if it were waiting for her, for the moment when she would accept it. And as she stood there, facing the inevitable, she felt a deep, quiet strength within her. She knew what she had to do. Julia stepped forward, her fingers now gripping the object firmly. The power surged again, but this time, instead of recoiling from it, she welcomed it. She embraced it. The light around her flared, growing brighter, but instead of blinding her, it became a part of her. She was one with it now, the energy, the object, the hollow room, it all merged into her, and for the first time, she felt complete. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was the master of this room. She had rewritten her own story. The walls of the hollow room, which had once seemed like a suffocating cage, began to crumble. The darkness that had once clung to every corner began to dissolve. The oppressive weight of fear and uncertainty lifted, leaving a space filled with light, calm, and peace. It was as if the very fabric of the room had been unraveled, and in its place, something new had been born, something that belonged to Julia, something she had created. The object in her hand pulsed one last time, and as it did, the figure appeared before her once again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't looming over her, wasn't speaking with its usual coldness. It stood before her, its form more solid, more human. Its eyes, once empty and hollow, now reflected something else, something like understanding. "You have done it," the figure said, its voice no longer the booming, threatening tone it had once been. It was calm, almost gentle. "You have faced your truth, and now you are free." Julia stood tall, her gaze unwavering as she looked at the figure. She had faced it all, the fear, the darkness, the uncertainty, and had come out stronger. The hollow room had tried to claim her, but she had claimed herself. The figure nodded, its form beginning to fade. "The room is yours now, Julia. The choice is always yours." And with those final words, the figure disappeared, leaving only the quiet sound of rain falling gently around her. Julia stood alone in the room, the light from the object fading into a soft glow. The hollow room was gone, its grip on her shattered. She was free. But even in her newfound freedom, Julia understood one thing: the room was always a part of her. Not as a prison, but as a reminder. A reminder that she had the power to choose, to face her fears and take control of her destiny. She closed her eyes, feeling the rain on her skin, and smiled. She was ready. Thank you for listening to this story from Horror Echo. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below telling us what you think. Don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying tales to keep you awake at night. Until next time, stay safe and sleep tight. Or, perhaps, don't sleep at all.